today are Allison Petrozziello. I'm going to mess up everyone's names. I apologize in advance. An accomplished doctoral candidate at Wilfrid Laurier University. Our second speaker will be Alexandre Charette, who is a postdoctoral fellow from Concordia University. And then we will hear from Professor Rupalim Bhuyan from social work at U of T. Rupalim is well known as an advocate for immigrant women. She's done a lot of work on immigrant women and domestic violence, for example. And then Tenzin Shim, who is an activist in the Tibetan community and a research assistant at University of Toronto. And Professor Jenna Henneberry from sociology at Wilfrid Laurier, and who also has a long list of other titles and roles that I'm not going to repeat right now, but who is also involved in advocacy, particularly for migrant workers, is going to make some remarks. So the way we're going to organize this, we're going to have the speakers one after the other. Then we're going to have questions and answers at the end. Please put your questions in the chat and your comments. And please turn off your phones, or at least turn off the noise from your phones. And for those of you who don't want your image to be shown, we are going to record the presentations, but you should shut down your camera if you don't want your image to appear in the recording. Okay, so without more ado, I would like to begin. Allison is going to talk about a gender-based approach to settlement, emphasizing the reasons why gender matters. So Allison.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. So I have been collaborating with the BMRC partnership through the Kitchener-Waterloo City Network for the last 3 years in collaboration with our 3 co-PIs and my co-author, Jenna Henneberry, and the other 2 are Dr. Margaret Walton-Roberts and Tara Bedard of our local immigration partnership. So our research aims to understand the relationship between gender and resilience amongst migrants with a temporary permit or who are seeking asylum in the region of Waterloo. So I added a few words to my title. We're taking a gender-based approach to settlement and integration support because I'm trying to flag that the way in which we are speaking about settlement services actually includes both informal and formal immigrant service providers and other community-based organizations that are serving migrants, including temporary migrants who may face barriers to eligibility to the formal settlement services. So as an overview of the talk today, we found that gender has a bearing on migrants' entry to Canada, their access to services, and how they cope with integration challenges. And the Government of Canada has committed to conducting gender-based analysis in policy and programming, a position reaffirmed as it championed gender responsiveness in the negotiations leading up to Canada's adoption of the Global Compact for Migration. So we ask, how well do these commitments translate to settlement work and integration support at the local level? So our research moves from high-level considerations of gender responsiveness in migration governance to consider its local application in the region of Waterloo, Ontario. So in the allotted time today, I will offer a few examples of the gendered realities and challenges facing migrants in our region, as well as some of the creative ways in which immigrants serving and other community organizations are seeking to address them. And then I'll conclude by offering some considerations for strengthening a gender-based approach to settlement. So here, just a quick overview of the methods. Our research team based at the International Migration Research Center carried out several workshops with community organizations that are serving temporary migrants and refugee claimants. Some of you were here with us in Waterloo a few years ago now. We also had another one on gender, sexuality, and refuge through a Laurier event. We conducted focus groups and semi-structured interviews with more than 70 migrants and interviews with more than 20 service providers. And so we had this focus on both the service providers and the migrants because we understand resilience as emerging at the intersection between individual and family capacity to respond to the challenges of migration and settlement, and institutional and community capacity to provide supports that foster newcomer resilience and respond to change. So what are some of the gendered realities that have come up in our research? We have flagged in other places as well that there are structural gender inequalities and that there may be fewer pathways available or accessible for women, relegating more of them to temporary categories. And I'll offer an example of this in the following slides. We find that temporary migrants may not be eligible for different kinds of social supports, including settlement support, childcare subsidy, and there are some delays in eligibility for child tax benefit. My apologies for my children in the background talking about gender-based constraints. Gender-based violence is also a cause of migration and experienced during and after migration for several participants who also shared experiences where frustrated male partners who had become violent or had abandoned their spouse and gone back to their country of origin. We heard accounts of parents fearing being reported to family and children's services. And in fact, one of the claimants I interviewed was reported as she was chasing her child with autism down the street and screaming to keep them from being hit by a car. And so then ends up getting reported. In terms of language acquisition, there may be gender differences in the rate or the pace at which women are able to learn English or French. Yet it is women, especially mothers, who are interacting with Canadian institutions through the schools, through doctor's visits, meeting with social workers, etc. There are also gender constraints around access to healthcare, and particularly sexual and reproductive health services, as well as issues around access to work, women being de-skilled, channeled into care work, housekeeping, etc. And then a lot of these challenges that face all migrants are compounded by risks of homelessness, food insecurity, and social isolation. So I wanted to offer just a few examples, if I can get the slide to move. One second. So here we have an example that illustrates some of the gendered experiences pre-migration and also the decision-making regarding pathways. And the yellow highlighting refers to a challenge faced, whereas the green highlighting refers to migrant agency or a coping strategy that's indicative of her resilience. So Anne, who's a computer engineer, has come to Kitchener as to do a graduate certificate, and she is from Iran and she's widowed. So she tells us about losing her husband 2 years ago and being in shock and thinking about making a new life for herself. And she recognizes that, okay, in Iran, in her words, my child will have no rights just like me and all the women in Iran. I do not want my child to be raised in a conservative country or to endure the embarrassing or disappointing little things after the loss of my husband. And so assessing her options, she says, I thought, okay, I know a little bit of English. I should go to some schools to remember more. I searched about so many places and thought that Canada is good because of the good communities. It's an English speaking country and that immigration is possible, unlike the US right now. And so she asked a lot of different people about going to Canada and says, all the doors were closed to me except coming in as an international student. So no refugee, no tourist, and no express entry. The only choice was this one. I thought, I'm a little too old for this, but I said to myself, this is not a bad opportunity for me to be upgraded a bit. The next example is also a graduate student who's from Nigeria and is a mother of 4. And so this is an example of someone with some needs and challenges that go beyond the supports offered by the university's International Students Office. So she says, I wanted my husband to come also, but I got my study permit earlier and he didn't get his work permit until 6 months after. The situation was stressful and difficult without my husband. For me, going back home to Nigeria was not an option as I had come here to study. The financial challenges, lack of good job opportunities were factors that did not appeal to my husband to live in Canada. He has his own business back home and is a professional. When he came to the House of Friendship and saw the food banks, he found it very difficult. It hurt his pride. Now I am here in Canada alone with 4 children trying to balance life with my PhD studies, and it is very challenging, especially with one who has special needs. So Kay has been able to access some support through a community organization's family outreach program and also through the YMCA. However, the community organization reported to us in our interviews with them that they had been debating internally whether their limited resources should go to supporting international students who've had to show that they have resources to support themselves in order to obtain a study permit to come to Canada in the first place. It should also be noted that the profile of international students is changing, with many more people, especially women, opting for this pathway to come to Canada, especially because it's perceived as more readily accessible. And I know we'll be talking about that in future webinars. So this is how we're thinking about gender responsiveness, now kind of shifting to a support and organization perspective. Our research aimed to understand if and to what extent gender responsiveness was part of integration programming. And as a principle, gender responsive strategies acknowledge that gender makes a difference in migrants' experiences and choices, and then responds in order to address gender specific needs and transforms practices to foster gender equality. So this is on the Gender and Migration Hub, which is a different project that we're building this hub with IRCC funding, so it's not BMRC, but it's just a quick visual as to how we're thinking about levels of gender responsiveness and wanting to move away from gender blind or gender biased programming towards gender sensitive analysis, where they're taking into account gender needs, gender specific programming, where that may be like women only programming, for example, but also moving towards gender responsiveness that is more transformative in its approach. So how well does our settlement system here in Kitchener-Waterloo recognize and respond to these challenges and problems? So in some areas, this is happening more than others. There is some good gender responsive programming, but we consider that maybe it should be made more accessible, more relevant. And so a good practice that we noted in KW was that gender responsive programming on reproductive health at community centers reached many women because it was scheduled to coincide with children's after school activities. And outreach workers, many of whom are more experienced and sometimes de-skilled migrant women, play a crucial role in making this programming accessible to more recent newcomer women. There were also employment programs that existed, but some of these may reinforce stereotypical gender norms. For example, teaching women how to sew. But organizations are innovating and adapting to meet needs. And so the Muslim Social Services is an example of this. They've expanded from offering counseling and mental health services to offer outreach and social assistance. And they do important work in terms of cultural bridging between different communities and the mainstream agencies and educating the public about experiences of Muslims who are coming to our region. But as I mentioned before, much of the programming that we might consider gender responsive is premised on the unpaid, or relies on the unpaid or underpaid invisible gendered labor of community volunteers, of migrant women who have not been able to exercise their profession and have been de-skilled and who are stepping up to fill in the gaps. And so here I have a quote from a community center outreach worker who talks about Jay, who is her go-to person when she has temporary people who need clothing or household items. She's so resourceful. She gets this through the community. She doesn't have any government help or funding or budgeting, but the way she works, it's just so important and valuable. To be honest, I think it should not be her job to do these things. She's doing it out of the passion, but I feel it's kind of taking advantage of a good heart of the people in a community when they decide to cut off on funding or stop a program because they say, oh, someone will pick up from the church. So faith groups have an important role, play an important role here in our informal settlement system as well. They run conversation circle programs. They have subsidized summer camps for kids. And often these coincide because as the quote says here from the same person, parents are basically studying, but kids during the summer, they need a program, they need to go places, they can't apply for subsidy. So the church camp is a place where this community outreach worker refers families. So the workshops that we conducted were an effort to start collectively building capacity on gender. Here is an example of a Laurier event, the Uprooted workshop that we held, which involved colleagues outside of the partnership, but was funded by a Shirk Connection grant. However, the participants and partners engaged were the same, and we had been interviewing them as part of the BMRC project. So it was kind of a form of participant observation and substantive engagement with some of these formal and informal immigrant services in the region. So the organizations that have been participating in these kind of workshops have important experiences to build on, but it's important to bring them together purposefully to continue to build this capacity. So what are we aiming for? I already mentioned the Government of Canada's commitment to conducting gender-based analysis in the policy cycle and all government-funded initiatives, which importantly do include immigration and settlement. And here's a graphic that talks about the gender-based analysis plus framework and how they are teaching civil servants to enact it. And there's international guidance as well. Gender responsiveness is a guiding principle in the Global Compact on Migration. This is just to flag the Gender and Migration Hub, which is still under construction. This is a sneak preview. And although it's not a BMRC product, it does inform our work because we're using the tools on the hub to examine the local context of Kitchener-Waterloo and to reflect on the extent to which gender responsiveness is present in the immigrant service landscape. So I'll just leave you with a few of these ideas about how to build on these experiences to create a gender responsive integration infrastructure. It requires participation and consultation of the organizations, including migrant women themselves and their grassroots organizations and initiatives. It requires gender responsive data, building capacity using the GBA Plus training. And we have several recommendations as to social services and gender responsive programming, which are in our research digest. And finally, our takeaway points. We argue in this chapter that in order to support the resilience of newcomers, policy and program must be responsive to their needs. And part of that is being gender responsive, right? So if needs and experiences are gendered, the policy and programmatic response must be gender responsive in order to foster migrant resilience. And there are opportunities to learn from existing experiences of immigrant serving organizations, women, and gender diverse migrants, and also to continue to build capacity to do gender-based analysis in all of the organization's work, but especially those receiving federal funding to do this. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Allison. That's fascinating and a wonderful way to begin this